Folks, thanks for coming along tonight, where Dr. Judith Pugh makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. I think the last time, or the previous time Judith Pugh was here, she spoke about her book, Unstill Art, Politics and Living with Clifton Pugh, which was published, and now she's completed a PhD, which deserves to be published, Images of a Nation, the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board. But tonight, Dr. Pugh is going to talk for us on the topic of Robert Menzies and the visual arts. Before I get her to commence, I should say she's a freelance journalist these days and also an author and a speaker at the Sydney Institute. Welcome.
Thank you, Gerard. The focus on Robert Menzies' involvement with and attitude to the visual arts almost always focuses on debates in 1936, especially when, as Commonwealth Attorney-General, Menzies promoted the establishment of an Australian Academy of Art and, opening a show at the Victorian Artists' Society, criticised some modern art. Menzies' critics overlooked the fact that the politics of the art scene was so complex that his academy was joined not only by traditional or conservative artists, but by modern artists such as Margaret Preston. The impression of Menzies provided by these critics, indeed by writers when considering his attitude to art, is not only that he intended to control the production of works of visual art by imposing traditional forms and restricting innovation, but that he did so as an outsider to the art world. Consider this anecdote. The Scottish artist William Frater, known as Jock, a lively, confident figure in the Melbourne art world, claimed that when he came to live in Australia in 1914, he had introduced modern art to the country. Easy acquaintance among people in the art world was inevitable in the 20th century Australia. The small group of artists, critics, buyers, art teachers and students would meet at shows in the few venues then exhibiting work. Younger artists, poets and writers met in cafes and pubs, which then closed at 6 p.m. I'm talking about the middle of the century. But bohemia met respectability at art world openings and at parties such as one given by the Melbourne architect John Scarborough in 1949. Menzies was then leader of the opposition in the Australian Commonwealth Parliament and apologised for arriving late, explaining that he had been delayed by important business, arrangement for his son Ken's marriage. Jock Frater, also a guest at the party, remarked, "What? Do you call marriage arrangements important business?" Menzies replied, "Maybe not for you, Jock. I doubt whether there's been a marriage in the Frater family for 100 years. But the Menzies are fussy." Frater was a liked and respected artist. If Menzies' remark had been controversial, it might well have had wider circulation in the art world, if not the political sphere. Frater's comment and Menzies' response imply an affectionate familiarity between host and guests. Launching Anne Henderson's book, Menzies versus Evatt, here at the Sydney Institute last month, John Howard remarked that while both men were lawyers, Menzies was the more successful politician. Political success requires reading the room. The lawyer in Menzies would be aware that the response could be taken not only as an insult but defamatory. But of course Menzies knew he was making an amusing response in a friendly context. He was very comfortable in the art world. After all, his father was an artist. James Menzies, Robert's father, was a coach painter. The label coach painter is Victorian in the sense of the century, not the place. This label meant effectively illustrator, a trained artist. James is great friends with Hugh Mackay, the entrepreneurial manufacturer of farm machinery, and James produced advertising images for Mackay's company, among them the image advertising the sunshine harvesters. Audience members of a certain age will recall the ad. Others should Google the phrase. James was an enthusiastic, generous man who constantly helped people. Kate Menzies, Robert's mother, became worried that James's health was at risk from the harsh Ballarat climate. The family moved to Jeparit, a town in the dry, hot Wimmera, where Kate's journalist uncle ran the local paper. Robert was born there in 1894. Robert Menzies' early childhood was thus under the intense Australian sun, where miles of golden wheat ripened against a high, blue Australian impressionist skies. Furthermore, the culture was replete in those days with artist-designed imagery. In a general store in a country town, the decorated tins and package arrived in equally picturesque vans. Commercial illustration was minute, precise, decorative, and illusion was everything. One imagines the obsessive father pointing out the intricacies, the flaws, the accuracy of the images. I suggest James's expertise in illustration focused his son's formation in art, and this explains Robert Menzies' view that excellence in art involved eloquent, accurate representation of recognisable forms. When James was elected to the state parliament to represent the rural district, the family moved to South Yarra in Melbourne. Robert chose Wesley instead of Scotch for his secondary education, studied law at Melbourne University, and practiced at the Melbourne Bar before his election to the Commonwealth Parliament. The extraordinary bounty of the Victorian gold rush had provided cities near Jeparit gilded, glorious buildings, and a boulevard of elegant houses along St Kilda Road, and ebullient celebrations of commercial, official and domestic architectural styles along the route to Melbourne University from South Yarra. And the university itself and the surrounding suburbs reinforced the coherence of graceful traditional forms which surrounded the visually alert and thoughtful young politician. In 1920, he married Patty Leckie, whose father had been a member of both the state and Commonwealth parliaments. He joined the Savage Club with many artist members. When defeated in the 1990 election, John Leckie had set up Leckie and Gray, lithographic printers and canister makers. The visual arts were part of the culture of the Menzies family. At the time of his exchange with Jock Frater, Menzies was a member of the Historic Memorials Committee of the Commonwealth Parliament. This powerful bipartisan committee, consisting of the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the leaders of the opposition in the Senate and the House, had been established in 1911 when Andrew Fisher was Prime Minister and Alfred Deakin Leader of the Opposition, to advise the Commonwealth Parliament on memorials of representative men. In 1912, the committee had appointed a board of trained artists to provide it with advice on the project. The board was known as the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board. Fisher's best friend was Hugh Patterson, one of a family of artist brothers who had migrated from Scotland, the best known being John Fawn Patterson. Hugh Patterson, who designed the Australian coat of arms, was appointed the first chair of the board. The initiative of the committee came from Tom Roberts, who was known to every member of the first Commonwealth Parliament, as he was commissioned to paint the opening ceremony. During that long toil, he was given privileged access to the facilities of the Victorian Parliamentary building in which the Commonwealth Parliament sat. The commission included a requirement for recognisable images of each parliamentarian. Opposite the Parliament, at the top of Collins Street, was a building of artists' studios. MPs mixed easily with artists. The economy of the visual arts was part of the taken for granted of the precinct. Malcolm Shepherd, secretary to Deakin, Watson, Reid and Fisher, and whose appointment as secretary of the newly formed Prime Minister's Department was announced in the same 1911 Commonwealth Gazette as the formation of the Historic Memorials Committee, remarks in his memoir that the decision to form the committee was taken to assist artists. The initiative was the first Commonwealth funding for the arts, providing the country with a painted record of the eminent men who founded the Commonwealth. The appointment of the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board in 1912 established a precedent that prevailed until 1973, that trained artists advised the government on matters relating to the visual arts. By 1949, Menzies had already made a non-traditional intervention in the work of the Historic Memorials Committee. Apart from the early competition to paint the Canberra Valley before the city was built, which assisted landscape artists, only portraits of Governors-General, Senate Presidents, Speaker of the House and Prime Ministers were commissioned. The committee had embarked on a program of buying portraits or of commissioning paintings of other historic figures, but in this program no female images had been suggested. Then in August 1943, Dorothy Tagney, an ALP candidate, was elected to the Senate from Western Australia. At the same election, Enid Lyons, who had been widowed when her husband, Prime Minister Joseph Lyons, died in office in 1939, was elected to the House of Representatives, a member for Darwin in Tasmania. Like her husband, Lyons represented the UAP, which was to become the Liberal Party. The Prime Minister, John Curtin, suggested to the Historic Memorials Committee that 2 women should be painted. The opposition leader in the upper house, Senator Macleay, while not opposing the proposal to record the historical significance of the election of the first women members of Parliament, thought their painting could reasonably be postponed. This was not necessarily a device to delay the portraits. It was 1944, February, and for Australia the war could rightly be seen as a priority. However, Curtin responded by reminding the group, as the minutes record, the Commonwealth already possessed a number of portraits which are part of the history of the Commonwealth. Although since 1902 women had been eligible to vote and to stand for the federal parliament, in 41 years none had been elected to either house, let alone held office, and he considered it appropriate for the committee to secure portraits of the original lady members. Mr. Menzies, leader of the opposition, agreed it was a historical event and asked he would prefer the item not be deferred. The Speaker thought that as an historic event was being commemorated, the portraits should be secured as close as possible to the occasion as practicable. The decision was made, not only to paint the lady parliamentarians, but to have them painted by lady portrait painters. Following Curtin's death, Ben Chifley became Prime Minister, and it was Chifley, a Labor Prime Minister, whose appointment to the board of J.S. Macdonald encouraged an image of deep conservatism. I could talk another time about Macdonald, Gerard. As Geoffrey Searle explains in his Australian Diction of Biography article, Macdonald was blindly hostile to nearly all 20th century painting and much before. There was, however, some advantage to the board's apparent conservatism, and I suggest Menzies understood this. The advantage in a time of war and social change was that it enabled it to persuade politicians and the public to build a national collection, that the nation needed a national gallery, indeed should be planning for it even in wartime, and also normalised the notion that the Commonwealth had a role in collecting for that gallery by directly subsidising the local art market. On the 19th of December 1949, as post-war austerity gradually gave way to optimism, Robert Menzies, now 55 years of age, took office as Prime Minister for a second time. The modern art world did not celebrate. Menzies' mid-30s proposal for an Australian Academy of Art, coupled with contemporary interpretation of remarks he had made about modern art, had played into the complex politics of the Australian art world and had established an idea of him as an inflexible traditionalist. Menzies certainly came to the Melbourne art world with a distinct idea of excellence in art and argued publicly for that view. However, the records reveal his actions on the Historic Memorials Committee and interaction with the board show him recognising and supporting change, establishing the board as central to the visual arts and the image of the Commonwealth, and underpinning his commitment with remarkable powers and funding. I want now to turn from Menzies and the committee and the board to consider the 1972 election of Gough Whitlam as Prime Minister. And here, Joe Kinsler said, "You should say you're not trying to blow your own trumpet." So I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet. In 1970, I'd been teaching in the poverty-stricken state school system in Victoria, and I wanted it to change, and I decided to join the Australian Labor Party. On the morning of my attending my first meeting, Clyde Cameron had supported the intervention by the federal ALP in the affairs of the Victorian branch of the party. He, who would be the most sophisticated and efficient member of the Whitlam cabinet, had decided that the principle of a decent education for all children was more important than the principle that no state funds should go to religious schools. Within the settler Australian population at that time, there was a deep religious divide affecting every facet of daily life. Cameron's choice delivered the death blow to that division. In the earlier 20th century, the issue of our living together in Australia is about what multiculturalism means, about fundamentalism of all kinds, about political correctness, about dealing with racism and religious intolerance. One forgets the religious attitudes that shaped generations of Australians. Left-wing in Victoria was an ideological position that implied rigidity, bureaucratic control and utter dullness. The population in a prosperous country for which the conscription for the Vietnam War was in fact the source of ideological division, where the grey conservative of the Depression and the World War was receding, where the population not only of European lifestyles of migrants, but also fashions and attitudes from America, wanted a change. It appeared at first that John Gorton, Prime Minister after Menzies' successor Harold Holt disappeared, would steer that change. Gorton seemed pleased to take the advice of the CAAB, and under his prime ministership, the Australian Film Development Corporation and the National Film and Television Training School were set up. His strategic mistake from the point of view of the Coalition's alliance with the arts was to set up the Australian Council for the Arts under the ownership of Herbert Nugget Coombs, that archetypal controlling public servant, and hand to it all arts but the visual, and also the crafts. A colonial Keynes without the Keynes' deep connection to the arts, Coombs saw himself as a more capable at managing or distributing funds than anyone actually working in the arts. Coombs, with Charles Moses from the ABC and newspaper man John Pringle, had set up the Elizabethan Theatre Trust in 1954. The trust was the only way in which a tax-deductible donation could be made at the time to the performing arts, and a donor could not even specify that the donation be for a specific project or theatre company. Nugget was a centralist whose idea of the role of government patronage was to bring culture to the masses, to educate the population rather than develop a local voice. In general, apart from one day of the year and the summer of the 17th doll, the subsidised theatres reproduced British and, on rare occasion, European or American drama. Coombs constituted himself patron and made funding decisions based on an outdated ideology that valorised high culture and meant traditional. This situation was intolerable for professionals who had struggled for years to develop an Australian voice, especially in the theatre. There is a curious resonance now as our actors leave for Los Angeles and our television ads are made in America, with the issues that were so important to artists in Australia in the 1970s. The concept of subsidising high culture as opposed to Australian culture affected playwrights, composers and filmmakers who wanted to produce an original Australian voice about Australian ideas on local subjects. When Gorton was dumped by his party in 1971, the Coalition lost the populist edge that went with his larrikin image. Despite its records on arts funding, under Billy McMahon the Coalition seemed mired in the past. But in 1970, the film initiatives, and indeed Gorton himself, had made the Coalition look relevant, as though it were loosening up in the right direction. My then partner, Clifton Pugh, had agreed to chair an arts policy committee for the Victorian branch of the party. The committee was established as an initiative of Actors' Equity by Clyde Holding, the then leader of the ALP opposition in the state parliament. The plan was to have a policy to take power from Coombs. The model adopted was for an Australia Council made up of the chairs of the boards of professionally trained people across the arts, funding to be provided on the advice of professionals. The challenge to have the ALP elected so that Australia could disentangle from the Vietnam War, engage with the New World Order, offering education to everyone, support medical changes, and other progressive initiatives, especially in the arts, was to get the public to identify the ALP in Whitlam with a lively, colourful future. But how? The deadly bureaucratic dullness of the Victorian ALP was a public relations challenge. Then on the 10th of February 1972, a journalist from Sydney rang. Cliff's portrait of the retiring Deputy Prime Minister, Black Jack McEwen, had won the Archibald Prize. Cliff understood what would happen next. Journalists will come, television and from the papers. They'll want a drink. I'll get some beer and some champagne. When they've finished with me, they'll want to talk to you. Now listen. Don't be shy and don't be indignant, whatever they ask you. Think about an interview as if you are paying for advertising, especially on television, but on radio or with a magazine or newspaper reporter. Stop before you answer and think, how do I use this question to say what I want? They just want a story, something to film or record or write about. Just keep thinking, what would it cost to buy this much time or space? Think about issues. Always remember, you may not like what the interviewer asks or says, but you are not talking to the interviewer. You are talking to the audience. Use the question to say what you want. When he came back from the pub with beer and champagne, I suggested, if you want to use this for the ALP, you should link McEwen, who everyone respects, with Whitlam. McEwen's resigning anyway, and you can remind them of this and say you're going to paint the next Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. You can link him with the environment and the war. Our local ALP candidate was Race Matthews, Whitlam's principal private secretary. I rang him and Whitlam agreed to sit for his portrait. While I handed out drinks, Cliff spoke to camera in his studio about art and the Vietnam War, then walked into the bush to talk about the environment. He was filmed, recorded and photographed, repeating the mantra over and over again. Next Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. Next Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. I needed a consistent story to change the image of the party. We went to Adelaide to paint Don Dunstan, and he agreed to support the arts policy at the federal conference, but added we needed the Treasurer or the Prime Minister to be Minister for the Arts. In pre-budget meetings, a weak minister, an outer cabinet ministers, or one whose area isn't strategic will lose in the share out of the cake, but no one will fight either the Prime Minister or the Treasurer for money. So you tuck your arts under their wings and you're okay. Maybe I could kill two birds with one stone. If I could add the glamour of the arts, particularly the entertainment industry, to the substance of ALP policies, that just might give the party a new image, while persuading them that the arts were the way to attract the attention of the swinging voter. Whitlam, fast on his feet, a barrister, educated, was the obvious choice. So I told him when he was sitting for his portraits the first time that we wanted him to be Minister for the Arts. No, I can't. You're silly, Judith. I'd be Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs. I might have to be Treasurer. I can't do it. I thought in terms of popularity. How could I make the party popular and get Whitlam to agree? And it came to me. I had access to the grassroots of popular culture. It was the people and the arts. The concept of the grassroots helps focus one's attention. The plan was simple and strategic, but if I could execute it, it would have an effect in a number of pleasingly intersected ways. It would connect the ALP with popular culture, thus making it hip. It would connect it with dance bands and musicals, making it something you might enjoy after a game of golf. It would connect the party with high culture, making it possible to get together with it over a glass of wine. It would confirm the policies and structure so carefully crafted by Cliff's committee. It would put arts funding on the agenda, and it would make Whitlam agree to be Minister for the Arts. It only required a little coordination. Whitlam would announce just one small element of the arts policy. Across the nation, figures from the arts would be asked by a journalist who just happened to be standing next to him or her at the time what they thought of the idea. They would say, I think it's great. I'm going to vote for the ALP. Then another announcement and more enthusiasm. Before trying it on Whitlam, I began to contact people in the arts to see if they planned to vote for the ALP and if they would agree to make their intentions public as part of this campaign. The initial response provided an insight into how things work. For example, Mary Hardy, whose brother Frank wrote Power Without Glory about the years in which John Wren exercised his questionable influence in Melbourne, was a broadcaster. Dad, I'd love to, but I couldn't. I'd lose my job. So I began with the self-employed, dance band leaders and visual artists, and it expanded, and it did change public perception of the ALP. I've written elsewhere of how I managed to persuade Whitlam to take on the arts portfolio. Suffice to say, the strategy worked. In fact, worked too well, it appeared as if it was his passion and commitment. It was a tool, and so successful it is not understood as a marketing strategy. To the chagrin of the union and the members of Cliff's committee, Whitlam, the son of a public servant and essentially unconnected from the arts, not only appointed Coombs as chair of the New Australia Council, but allowed him to translate his first-nighters onto the council instead of appointing professionals, and, for example, to refuse to establish a community arts board. This meant years of dispute and a flawed history, incorrectly valorising Coombs and Whitlam. To return to Menzies. As I remarked earlier, Menzies used the apparent conservatism of the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board to manage the turbulent art politics of the time. He moved early on in this way, even while Chifley was chair, when amusingly he was assisted in this by the supporters of modernism. John Reid, who with his wife Sunday collected and through the Contemporary Art Society exhibited modern artists, wrote a letter to the committee and board deriding its members and its attitudes and demanding they purchase a particular Nolan picture. The committee minutes record, having decided to take no action on Reid's request, the committee heard from Mr. Ashton that he had been intending to resign from the board. Mr. Menzies and others paid tribute to his work, and after discussion he was asked to continue to give the Commonwealth the benefit of his wide knowledge and experience in art and culture. Hence, this very sweet, conservative painter of the sea and ships, who had been appointed to the board in 1917, I think, he didn't retire until something like 48. He, even later, actually in the 50s. And he appeared to be sort of dodderingly conservative. In the meantime, Menzies put on modernists underneath him. So people they still carry on about how terrible it was. And you think, what? Reid's attack just had the opposite effect of what that he intended, as it highlighted Ashton's long service and elicited a defence of his contribution. In May 1952, Prime Minister and Chair of the committee, Menzies appointed to the board Darrell Lindsay, 62 years old, Director of the National Gallery of Victoria, and Robert Campbell, 49, Director of the South Australian Gallery. Each of these men had managed to bring various institutions into the 20th century by liberalising practices, developing community engagement, improving physical infrastructure and broadening collection policies. Lindsay had enlivened the NGV. Campbell had improved not only the Western Australian and Queensland galleries and was in 1952 updating the South Australian Gallery. In 1941, offering a very clear illustration of the long road travelled by Australian society from that time, Campbell had brought the Launceston Technical College into the 20th century by removing swimsuits from life models. Menzies was very enthusiastic when London's Tate Gallery agreed to stage a survey of Australian painting in 1962. This event has attracted inaccurate and unscholarly critical attention, but at the time was a coup for the Australian government. London was still then the centre of Western art and the market, and acknowledgement by the Tate would ensure Australian painting would be taken seriously. The planned exhibition was shown first in Adelaide, and drama ensued. Scholars and commentators do not remark that before the show opened in Adelaide, Menzies added Russell Tas Drysdale to the board. Drysdale's impeccable modernist credentials should have pacified any critic, but the announcement was drowned out by the controversy. The excitement meant that Hans Huyssen was dropped from the show, which gesture itself emphasises the changing fashion of accepted in the arts. Huyssen has undeniably returned to the pantheon, and the selection was extended to include younger artists. There are very full notes of the meetings between Menzies, Tate director John Rothenstein, and the chair, Colin Anderson, about the Tate exhibition. Menzies very clearly states that the board wants to emphasise the 20th century. He asks if the Tate wants a spread of contemporary men of competence or a number of works by first-class painters. Rothenstein advises the second. They discuss ending the show with a flourish, but not a large flourish, of young contemporary artists. The notes show no evidence at all that Menzies, having agreed with Anderson the show would be a survey of Australian art with an emphasis on recent painting, made any effort to influence the selection. Both Rothenstein and Colin Anderson did exert influence. Files in the Tate archives shows that Anderson and Rothenstein wanted only oil paintings, not sculpture or watercolours. In addition, in two internal communications, Anderson confirms to Rothenstein he has rejected the idea of Aboriginal work being included. It had been in the original exhibition. Anderson and Rothenstein were dismissive of Darrell Lindsay's initiative in this regard. Writing to the Australian High Commissioner on the 26th of August 1960, Rothenstein explained that interest in Aboriginal paintings was only partly aesthetic and for the most part anthropological. The records show that the board subsequently sent an exhibition of Indigenous bark paintings and nothing else to the Sao Paulo Biennale. Menzies was then Prime Minister and overseeing the work of the board. I want here to provide an example of the attitude to Menzies still prevailing in the art world and to finish with reality. Describing Menzies' opening speech, where he proudly confirmed his involvement in the Tate Show, Sarah Scott, a stringent critic, states, "The influence of Menzies' artistic preferences and conception of a national aesthetic had a profound effect upon the construction of a nation within overseas exhibitions of Australian art, as well as limiting the opportunities available for contemporary Australian artists to exhibit abroad." It is unclear what Scott means by the limited opportunities for contemporary artists to show abroad. An extensive program exhibited Australian art abroad, and there was no embargo on artists exhibiting anywhere. An alternative interpretation for Menzies committed to the Tate Show is that he was enthusiastic about the Tate Show. Here, both his affection for Britain and his delight in Australia and in Australian art were brought together in a very grand celebration. Loving history and a certain form of painting, he wanted to show the history of Australian painting. Admiring Australian impressioning, he wanted to show the best of these works, but at no time did he demand any control over the modern end of the show, and there is no indication that the board contacted him for an opinion. Menzies' government energetically sent broad selections of work to Asia and South America and Europe. In common with other commentators, Sarah Scott fails to understand the formal relationship between the board and the Prime Minister, believing that board members were public servants, subject to line management. She sees Menzies' involvement at all as ministerial interference in public service process. In fact, the reverse was true. Menzies, like Andrew Fisher and Curtin, allowed the board to spend public money in a grey constitutional area. Menzies, however, went even further than any other Prime Minister. While by the 1960s there was a budget allocation for promoting art, the courts had not entirely resolved questions as to the delegation of ministerial powers. Menzies, a constitutional lawyer, was very well aware of this. The clearest indication that Menzies was prepared to accept modern art is that he made an astonishing decision in 1961 to delegate his own ministerial authority to make contracts to board members. This was remarkable. The time when you wanted to buy anything, you had to get it signed off by 4 people, and you went down to the basement and there was the man in the grey dust coat and he said, "You haven't found this one," and you'd say, "Oh, well, I'll just get it to sign." "No, you've got to start again." And Menzies, delegated his authority so that people would go into a studio and say, "Send that to Canberra." This decision is outlined in the minutes of the board meeting on the 23rd of June 61. In January that year, the board had raised not only the question of its members' expenses, they'd all been subsidising the thing themselves, but also a realistic budget for purchase and an efficient system for such purposes. The public servant supporting the board, Ms. Cusker, reported that Menzies had made certain decisions in response to their requests. Each member would have a personal budget of £300. Now, I use this inflation calculator and it says sort of approximately £20,000, but in fact in terms of art I'm quite sure it was more, substantially more, because by 1971 their final figures for their budget was $999,999. They'd had a budget of just under $1 million, and because there were 6 of them, it's 6 into $1 million or whatever. So one should, in 1971 they were spending $1 million and were the world's biggest spenders in the art market. If the board wanted to spend money beyond the allocated budget, they could approach the Prime Minister. Also, the Prime Minister had agreed new principles which would have the effect of conferring on the board certain executive powers. These were purchase of paintings for the National Collection. Where the board is unanimous about the acquisition of a painting for the National Collection, it may be acquired without reference to the Prime Minister. However, from time to time the Prime Minister would wish to inspect the acquisitions the board has made. Purchases by individual members. Each member, with his individual allocation, was now able to purchase work which might form part of the National Collection or hang in government establishments, as well as for overseas posts. Exhibitions. The amount allocated for exhibitions may be used at the discretion of the board to assist exhibitions going abroad or coming from overseas for circulation in Australia. Under this item, selection need not necessarily be made by the board. The board could consider each request and decide whether assistance should be made available and the extent of any such assistance. Menzies, who must have taken into account a decision by Evatt in the Bardolph case limiting delegation, risked that his delegation of power could become a legal or political problem. That is, as a constitutional lawyer, he knew there was a question as to whether he could delegate his power to purchase, but he stood by his political judgment and his confidence in his advisers. He delegated this power, despite having on frequent occasions not accepted board recommendations for purpose, ordinarily because he was very conscious of the value of pictures. So he didn't say, "No, I don't like it because it's blue," or "No, I don't like it because it's by so-and-so." He said, "I think we won't have it at the moment, it's too expensive." He decided to suspend his own judgment as to artistic style and to defer to the board's expertise. The date of the memo predated the Tate exhibition. Menzies may not have wanted to collect avant-garde work, but he came to accept that all forms of contemporary art had validity and that his experts would choose, on technical grounds, the best work for the National Collection. For Whitlam, engagement with the arts was a political strategy. Menzies came to politics already deeply engaged and saw Commonwealth subsidy to the visual arts expand and develop throughout his Prime Ministership. Thank you.
Many thanks, Judith Pugh. So now we come to questions and discussion. No need to stand up, but don't stand in front of the camera, and we'll get underway. So you start off with Menzies, you go to Whitlam, you go back to Menzies. But I think possibly the general feeling about the 50s and the 60s as it's presented these days in universities is that Menzies did nothing in the arts. You're talking the visual arts, but the general arts, including the visual arts. Whitlam, on the other hand, was the saviour, but they both had to deal with Nugget Coombs in different ways. Menzies is Coombs the economist, Whitlam is Coombs the art advisor. Manning Clark spoke about, as I recall, the years of unleavened bread. What was that all about?
Well, what was the unleavened bread all about? I don't know.
The general thesis that
I think
Menzies was
because
against the art and Whitlam was the great art. Yeah.
well, Menzies put money into, for instance, the Mar Music Bowl. He opened the Mar Music Bowl. The national government was actually trying to build things as well. It was a great time of great development of things. But particularly, as I said, he quietly went on setting up this situation so that the national collection was developed during his time, and he put people on the board who bought modern paintings, and he allowed, when I say allowed, he didn't prevent exhibitions going overseas. There was one public servant who got in the way for a while, but the board, you can see, I mean, this is a whole thesis, but the board moved, really realising this was happening, just got to Menzies. Eventually, the reason that this meeting happened and that he delegated his authority was that Darrell Lindsay wrote to him and said, let's get together with the girls. Their wives knew each other. And they obviously had a happy meeting, and then there's a formal letter saying, you know, maybe we could do these things. But they obviously decided together what should be in the formal letter and what was possible. And suddenly there's a whole lot of complaints to the newspapers. It has to have been a campaign where people are saying, why have we got all these pictures that are and sculptures and things that are in hiding? Why can't we have a gallery? So he appoints a commission to look into the gallery, the building of a gallery. And then there's the most wonderful other minute where McCusker says to the head of McCusker's a deputy secretary, writes to the secretary of the department saying, this morning Mr. Menzies advised the members of the Art Advisory Board that they would be the interim counsel of the National Gallery. I said, of course, that just as we had set up the Aboriginal Institute and about 4 things that they'd done, so there would of course be a member of somebody from the Prime Minister's Department and the Attorney General's. Mr. Menzies made it clear that it would not be so, it would just be the artists, and I suggest you do not raise the question with him. So he'd obviously said no. So he was, you can see he always knows what's going on, he's very focused, and he's very shrewd in his judgments.
That's not the general interpretation, is it? So you're going to change that?
I hope so. I expect to.
I just want to take the point about the difference between Menzies, Whitlam, whatever, and one the conservative, the other the avant-garde.
Yeah.
Gideon Haigh pushes this line in the book on Evatt. He's the brilliant boy. And he talks about a competition or an art competition in 1936, an exhibition of Ray Lawler, and uses that to suggest that Menzies was a conservative because he maybe didn't like it, I can't remember. But the Sunday read, the reads down in Melbourne, how much was that the influence on the media in that they were a nice little set? Evatt was great friends, they were Labor. You've come from Victoria, you know a bit more about this. How much was that idea of Menzies not being involved with the arts pushed by this clique of artists that hung around the Labor Party?
It's really astonishing to me. You have to remember Evatt is married to Mary Alice Evatt is a trained painter, and that's how he, I think, became interested in the arts, in visual arts. And Menzies did make remarks. He went to England. As I say, I mean, there are a lot of people even now who say that Picasso just distorts things. They don't understand Cubism, and they don't understand the way in which art changed really after Cézanne when he changes the picture plane. But Menzies did say at what's his name's opening, and also he said at the opening of the Victorian Artists Society, he said he was unfortunately, that's Alan Martin, his biographer says, standing opposite the modern painters in the Victorian Art Society's rooms. The Victorian Art Society is not unlike Burlington House, the Academy in England, in London, I mean, where you became an art. You want to have your pictures shown. You get your pictures shown every quarter or whatever, and I think it was sort of notion that they would ultimately become an academy where they decided the standard. But he was unfortunately standing there, and he says much of modern art is distortion, and one of the most sort of romantic and excitable people is in that show and thinks he is saying modern art is distortion. They don't hear them much. And I think it did become a very exciting, contestable thing. John Reed's letter invites a slap in the face. I mean, it's extraordinary. Why you would write to anybody who... Reed he's born in the biggest house in Tasmania, is massively rich, and he just thinks that people should fall in front of him. And so he condescends to them and accuses them of their sort of dreadful... And so you have to buy this painting of the Hardman Range. Well, they're not going to. It's not a polite way of going about it. And they were very polite. And I think, well, who else? There's a wonderful remark in Donald Friend's diaries. He says that the difference between Melbourne and Sydney is that down there, if you go to one set and not the other, you'd never be out to dinner again. But in Sydney, we all hate each other's work, but nonetheless, we all get about it. Remember, Melbourne had a formal teaching school, and Sydney did not. They had private ones. So there's something about the authority of the sort of line that's being run, I think, that has an effect on people. But I mean, even now, people get excited. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
I'll just take the... Oh, you go... Okay, I've got a question here, but go on. No, hang on, no, just stop for a minute. Okay, Ted. Get the mic.
I'm trying to remember what Menzies' attitude was to Dobell's portrait of him, which I thought would be fairly
enlightening. He didn't like it, but he sat for it.
Exactly.
And he that's the point. I mean, he allowed artists to do what they wanted. There is another story, actually. I was thinking of you, Anne, because it's about Everett. Bill Dargie tells the story in his recorded interview about being on the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board, and he went to great pains to persuade Dame Mary Gilmore to donate the Dobell portrait that she owned, her own Dobell portrait, to the National Collection. And he said he's walking across the grass to the meeting of the Historic Memorials Committee, and he says to Campbell, I'm really worried because, Menzies does not like Dobell. And Campbell says, don't be silly. Everybody knows it's the best portrait Dobell painting. There is no question it will go through. So they arrive, and in comes Ed and says, what's that doing here? And Dargie says, Everett arrived and says, what's that doing here? And Dargie says, well, Dame Mary Gilmore has said that this is surplus to her requirements, and so we're able to acquire it. She's giving it to the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board, or rather to the Commonwealth Collection. And Everett says, everybody knows it's the worst portrait he ever painted, we don't want it. And Dargie says the worst part of this is that for weeks afterwards he kept going to meetings to be abused by artists, saying he had refused the portrait. But he was the people that Menzies chose, and I think this is actually another difference between him and Whitlam. Cliff, who was a great portrait painter and an enormously good, snappy judge of people, used to say that the really failing of Whitlam was that he put the wrong person into the wrong job all the time, whereas Menzies put the right people into the right jobs. And those men had to put up with hysteria from young artists when they weren't selected or something, and they blandly went about their business, and they never criticised Menzies, and they never gave the game away.
Before we do, just a background to the portrait. Just tell us the story about it. So, what did Menzies think of the portrait, and what happened to the portrait?
Well, we don't know what. I think it's in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, but we don't know what Menzies thought of it. We know that he didn't like Dobell's work, but it was thought by Dargy and by Campbell that because he accepted their advice, they would have the portrait. It was Evatt who rejected it.
Okay, so what portrait is there of Menzies in Parliament House now? Who did that? Do we know? You don't know.
Oh, I don't remember.
Not
Because
important.
somebody actually attacked one of his portraits, so he had to sit again.
Admittedly, what we remember is the It's Time campaign. It's the It's Time campaign. Do you think that is what, for the last 50 years, has created the idea that it is the Whitlam government and Whitlam himself that was all art
Yeah,
and nothing before that at all?
that's right.
Tell us about going back from that. So I guess Whitlam is best known for Jackson Pollock's blue.
So I took a telephone call one day.
So what year are we in now? 1973, are we?
I think so. That's
Yeah, okay.
what I am using the mic. Can anybody else hear me? He is deaf. He said, took a telephone call and it's Gough, Judith, can I speak to Cliff? And I said, we've just gone down for the paper, but I'll get him to ring you back. What can I say it's about? And he said, I've been asked to buy a picture by a bloke, very expensive, by a bloke I've never heard of, called Jackson Pollock. Well, it's rather unfortunate. When I was 14, my mother's best friend was working for Violet Dooler at the South Yarra Gallery. And she said that I should spend the summer at this National Gallery summer school. And so I trotted off, my parents enrolled me in the children's thing, and suddenly Lester, who's been to the National Gallery, swoops on me. She was very much a swooping person, and she swooped along, and she had a man with her, and I'd been drawing or whatever I was supposed to do, and she said, see what I mean? And he said, yes, all right. And suddenly I'm taken and I'm put in the grown-ups summer school, and given, some paper and a pencil, and a man without any clothes on. I had never seen such a thing. And I, drew him. And the grown-ups gave me paints in the afternoon. And so I had a wonderful time. And in the evenings, a woman named Mary Cecil Allen, who's an Australian, who had tutored the Rockefeller children and who lived in New York and who knew all the sort of American abstract painters, gave a series of talks on American abstraction. So I'm 14 years old, and the grown-ups authoritatively say these are great paintings. So I say to Whitlam, I have never opened my mouth since I got to live with Cliff about any paintings at all, but I just go into, what I know, and I say, no, don't worry at all, Gough. He's very, very well-known painter. They're great paintings, and I'm quite sure it'll be all right. Oh, thanks, says Whitlam. When Cliff comes back from getting the paper and says, I say, Whitlam rang and he wanted you to ring him. Apparently they want to buy a Jackson Pollock. It's blue poles and very expensive. And Cliff said, it would be wonderful, but I don't think so. I think it'd be a terrific political risk. And I said, well, I told him to buy it. And he said, what are you doing, telling him to buy it? And I said, everybody knows. And then I sort of rattled off what I knew. And he said to me, how do you know that? And I said, well, I went to the National Gallery School. And he grabbed the phone and rang up, and Whitlam said, I've just signed off on it. So he did seek advice occasionally, but unfortunately from the wrong person.
Talk about Cliff Pugh for a moment. He was, I don't know anything about art, but Cliff Pugh was very astute, I think.
Yep.
He was astute about Whitlam. He was the one who understood when he painted John Kerr's portrait that Pugh just wasn't a pushover, that he had ideas of his own.
Yes.
He painted Daniel Mannix. He had a good understanding, I think, of Mannix, an appreciation in a way, but he wasn't a fan of Mannix, obviously. So, and some of the stories you're telling tonight, he was pretty astute, I guess, on Nugget, as they called him, Nugget Coombs as well. So he was an artist, but he was a bit more than that, wasn't he?
Oh, yes. Well, I think, first of all, he'd been in the army. See, you have to remember that whole group of people, John Brack, Cliff, that section of artists who came back and then went to the National Gallery School had all been in the army. You have to make a very quick decision when you're going to shoot somebody dead. You've got, and I think that trains you early to sum up the situation. And then, of course, training as an artist makes you observe and look and put, as Cliff used to say, look and put and look and put. And if you are a student, he grew up in the country, they have a fairly good judgment of people. And then he, of course, refined that as a portrait painter. So he was extraordinary. You could go into a room and he would say, if I asked him, he would remark about people.
Just get a microphone to you.
He just like an ice cream.
Ice cream, okay.
Yeah, it's
Like-
one of those sort of
like
nights.
it.
Yeah, it's an ice cream night.
So the question is really, it's a wonderful topic. You've educated us all on, or me anyway. But do you have a view as to whether there is a particular leader or prime minister that did more for the arts community than others did?
Well, in the visual arts, it's Menzies. There's no question
Right,
about
okay.
that. But because you set up a structure to buy. But one of the interesting things for me is in all of the discussions, people don't really think about the difference, and even now, the difference between the economy of the visual arts and the economy of the performing arts. If performing arts means bums on seats, means you open, there's no one there, you're not going to do it. I mean, there's always the stories of people coming in eventually and the word getting around. If you paint a painting and it doesn't sell, for instance, as Albert Tucker's first Images of Modern Evil People paintings did not sell, eventually you keep on painting and people start buying and you've got a certain price. And you've still got the originals, and they go up because people like early paintings, and often they're the most sort of exciting. And so a visual artist creates capital, and he keeps that capital with them. And whereas creative artists generally do, but visual artists do it fast and keep it. Whereas, if you write a book, you're sort of creating capital, and you need the solitude and the place and the time to write. And the same as an artist, a visual artist needs solitude or somewhere, or a studio and somewhere and time, and to be able to sustain themselves while they're doing that. Whereas performing artists, it's a totally different economy. I mean, it's sort of coming nearer with recording, but fundamentally theatre is quite different, and yet we have the same funding model for them both. And I think they should be separated. And one of the things you're talking about Nugget Coombs, see Nugget, who saw himself as this wonderful patron of the arts, hated Dargy, and Dargy returned the favour, I think, although he never said it, but Nugget was very aggressive. There's a marvellous minute where Nugget is setting up an inquiry into the crafts, and it says who's going to be on it. It invites somebody from the Visual Arts Board, but it says it is not thought necessary to have anybody from the crafts industry. And you wouldn't do it with engineers, you wouldn't do it with surgeons, you wouldn't do it with anybody else with expertise, but with I know better. So not to have anybody on it. So one of the things that really irritates me in the valorisation of Coombs is that he was responsible for the biggest breach of copyright in the universe, which is that he used the image by an Indigenous artist for the $1 note and then produced millions of them. And we still don't know how much he gave him, because he doesn't send him to a lawyer. And there was a question that the Indigenous people weren't supposed to be given money, so you could, but set up a trust. It's just an astonishing thing, and yet people think he's wonderful. Whereas there's a wonderful moment, because the Visual Arts Board, the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board, didn't just do exhibitions and buy pictures. They got control they had control of the look of the nation. They chose people on the stamp board. They did medals. They did immigration certificates. And in all of these, you can see the advice coming through, and it's not conservative. It's for when Menzies is involved, it's not sort of, you must do this. It's always sort of allowing people to be creative. And there's a wonderful minute where they find out that, I forget what, might be Treasury has produced some kind of medal it's giving to people and they haven't designed it. And then it turns out that they haven't done anything about copyright, which is one of the reasons, because they know about copyright, that they control all that sort of thing. And there is an absolutely infuriated minute by Taz Drysdale, who after all was on the board of CSR. I mean, his family was very powerful, and he was and very efficient. He was used to having things done properly, and here are these public servants who've done the wrong thing, and now he's got to deal with the fact that they've sort of, I forget whether they breached their own copyright or somebody else's or what have you, and he's sort of trying to deal with it. So,
just a brief comment too. Coombs made that decision when he was governor of the Reserve Bank.
yes.
That's why it's on the $1.
Well, they did.
The note.
That's what Menzies did was Coombs and the Reserve Bank got to make the paper money, and the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board did the beautiful Devlin coins. It was to stop them arguing, I think.
So just finally, we've only got about 2 minutes. So just summarise for us your thesis on the Commonwealth. What is
Art
it again? The
Advisory
Commonwealth
Board.
Art Advisory Board. Very briefly, what happened to that?
Well, it's still the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board was stopped by Coombs immediately. They didn't even get letters saying thank you. Later, Menzies wrote to some of them, but not to Dargie. They just were told not to bother coming. The management of the arts, then there was, of course, chaos. But fortunately, they were already on the board of the National Gallery, so they just went on acquiring things for that. And other bits and pieces, they started giving grants, which had never been given. And because again, it's an economy, this is what you're buying. They did commission some things and manage those very carefully. And you can see also, they're desperately trying to get women to take commissions. We're always busy doing something else. So I suppose the thing I love about doing this, I did it because my supervisor, Robert Mann, when I started, said, I wanted to write about the art world in the 20th century, and he said, is there a spine? And I said, I suppose the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board. And one of the things that really irritates me is that there is all these views about them. So I get a scholarship, I go to Canberra, I go into the National Archives, I write out a thing for the files I'd like to start with, and I go and have some coffee. And when I come back, they say, oh, they haven't been examined. Nobody had actually ever opened the files. 60 years, and they hadn't opened the files, but they all have views about what went on.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
So thanks for a fine performance and some enlightening views, and I've learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure others have too, and some great stories about some well-known Australians. So when you do your next, when your thesis becomes a book, as it should, come back and talk about the Commonwealth Art Advisory Board, and we'll get some other insights of a fresh kind into people we know about but don't know all that much about. So well done today, and good luck. Okay.